Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
He's an artist, a pioneer. We've got to have some music on the new frontier.
All right, we are talking new frontiers. We talk about it, I feel like, every day. Anything and everything to do with artificial intelligence, specifically Gen AI, LLMs, large language models, the components that play into it, the power that's going to be needed to power the data centers, and who is doing all of the build out. Having said that, we've been watching Dell Technologies. Stock rallied in today's session, up about 8%. Some news, Loop Capital, which has a buy on the stock, raised the price target from 125 to 185, boosted some investor confidence. Keep in mind, Dell does report earnings on May 30th, so that's tomorrow after the close. And then yesterday, some news of Dell expanding its AI factory with NVIDIA to include new server edge workstation solutions and services advancements that speed AI adoption and innovation. There's a lot going on. Michael Dell, just about a week and a half ago, talking about AI PCs being pretty standard in 2025. So we have a great guest to talk about a lot of what is going on here. He participated in a panel with me, put on by our Bloomberg Intelligence team, looking at generative AI, specifically on the potential build out by companies of AI data capabilities on-site or on-premise. With us is John Roese. He's Global Chief Technology Officer at Dell Technologies, joining us from New Hampshire. John, so nice to have you here. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. There is a lot coming at us right now. Talk to us about what you are seeing. We talked about at that Bloomberg Intelligence event about what companies were doing, what their demands would be, to bring things on site, on premise. What's been some of the conversations that you are having with clients around this as of late?
Yeah, I mean, let me rewind a little bit. Last year, the first year of the AI era, I think most enterprises were trying to figure out what should they do, and largely most of the large enterprises did a lot of experimentation. This year is different. This year, many of those initial experiments, which were really trying to figure out where to apply this technology for the best return. If you're an enterprise, you can apply AI to anything, but if you apply it to your supply chain or your product development cycle or something that really moves the needle from an economic perspective, that'll have a bigger impact. So I think today most enterprises are triangulating on where to apply it, which then gets them to the discussion of how to apply it. And that's where, the panel we had when we were chatting kind of went, which is, this is not a workload that's, sitting on the side used by 3 people. This is the center of your enterprise. It's going to run nonstop 7/24. It's going to power your sales process. It's going to power your customer satisfaction. And so choosing the right place to run it, whether that, that gives you the best economic outcome, the best control, doesn't get you into compliance and regulatory challenges, is really the dialogue that's happening now. And so a lot of the work we're doing that you mentioned on the intro around with our ecosystem around NVIDIA and Meta and everybody else is, how do we reduce the complexity to make that decision? How do we make it easier for people to get started, to not have to do everything, and to really get the platforms in place where they need them? And in our opinion, one of the best places to do some of this stuff is clearly in their owned infrastructure. One, it tends to be a CapEx model, and 2, it's in your control, and it's much more predictable.
John, for years we've heard about the cloud being what's nimble, and the cloud being the place that we can do this stuff and secure. This stuff for less expensive. I'm wondering, the shift to on-premise is not a shift. It's been around since before the cloud. But why are we seeing and talking so much about this shift right now?
Yeah, remember, the cloud era was all about taking your existing workloads, your web servers, your email, your office productivity, and maybe trying to figure out a different way to operate it. By the way, cloud wasn't just public cloud. The cloud model pervaded everything. And so, the shift to autonomous, automated, elastic infrastructure happened with a set of applications that we understood well. The things we're building now look nothing like that. A large-scale generative AI system for an enterprise is arguably the most demanding and complex workload you will create in your lifetime. And so, you could argue that, an OpEx-driven as a service model that gives you lots of agility, but you pay by the drip, is not a very good outcome if the thing you're running runs 7/24 at enormous performance levels. You don't want that meter running. You want that meter to be predictable. And so it's just a different class of workload. By the way, we're big proponents in multi-cloud. A lot of the time, the best place to develop your AI system is in one of the cloud providers because they have a great tool chain. the best place to test it might be there. Maybe the best place to train your models might be there because you only need the infrastructure for a short period of time. But the minute it becomes inference, that you're putting it into production and it's using your data, which by the way, most of that is on-prem even today, then it starts to become a very different discussion, which brings kind of this modern on-prem architecture that we talk about with the AI factory into play as probably one of the more logical places to start.
Well, what is exactly the concept of an AI factory?
Yeah, okay. So here's the important thing for people to realize. AI is a new workload, and by the way, it actually needs a new class of infrastructure. The type of compute is not CPUs, it's GPUs. The type of data is not traditional databases, it's vectorized data that lives in large language models. The kind of tools you use are different. And so what we talked about at Dell Technologies World last week was not a new set of products exclusively. It was you really probably need to have a separate type of infrastructure for your AI than you do for the traditional things that you do, those workloads that went through the kind of cloud migration we talked about. And what the AI factory is it's an articulation of what that infrastructure looks like, that it is accelerated compute, that it's a different kind of data architecture, it's a better and different type of networking architecture, and that it probably lives in a different footprint because it itself has different requirements than your legacy applications and the other applications you run in either a public cloud or a private environment. And so the AI factory is how do you create a methodology and organize all the technology to put that in play, whether it's at a rack level or even an entire data center that builds you the optimal infrastructure to run these new workloads that you're going to need. So think of it as just a paradigm shift. We're going to have to build new infrastructure for this new workload. It might be redesigning or optimizing what we have, and it might, in fact, be a new data center build out.
John, it's really interesting, and I think we might have talked about this at the Bloomberg Intelligence event, but about, technology companies, they compete, they work with each other. And it was interesting at Dell Tech World, the keynote stage, to see Jensen Huang, NVIDIA's CEO, up there. And so there's really, you can see the partnership. You can see there's clearly a show of support from NVIDIA to you guys at Dell. What is the nature of this partnership, especially when they make their own AI server racks, which makes you competitors to some degree?
Yeah, remember, Dell's a unique company. We are obviously very large, and you could argue we're the largest technology integrator in the world. Now, it means something to different people, but basically, I don't build my own CPUs or GPUs, but what I do is I organize that technology into consumable units of IT that my customers across the world can consume. Now, when you look at what NVIDIA is doing, they clearly are the provider of some of the better GPUs in the world. There are other choices that we also work with. Mm-hmm. They also have organized their stack in a way that makes it very easy to consume, and I think they did a great job there. And so they have an early lead, and it's an important lead that they're making it much more consumable, and they're keeping the innovation cycle up. However, their ability to engage with the large enterprise across the world, they don't have we have a much larger sales force. We have a global services capability. We have the largest supply chain that's secure in the world in technology. And by the way, you also don't just need the GPUs, you need the advanced storage services, you need to integrate it with your existing infrastructure, you need to talk to your existing data, which by the way, rides pretty much on Dell Technologies storage systems. And so the nature of the relationship is, look, hey, you're trying to build an AI factory. There are some leading edge parts that absolutely have to be produced. And one way to actually make sure that they happen correctly is to integrate them into a system, an early system, like what NVIDIA does. However, those parts are decomposable, and then they can reassemble into other form factors that companies like Dell can take to a much more scalable market, like the announcements around Edge and other areas. We have the ability to reach more customers than anybody in the world. We need partners to help us build the technology to bring it to them.
Is it a deeper relationship? Just got about 40 seconds, then we'll come back and continue. Yeah. But is your partnership with NVIDIA a little bit different? Is it a deeper one? Because you do have partnerships with other server manufacturers as well and others. Is it a deeper relationship, or how would you call it?
Yeah, we work with a lot of companies. Yeah. What I will tell you is it's the first one. It was the deepest. Last year we announced Project Helix, which was the first time anybody articulated putting all the parts together into something people could consume. So it has a significant first mover advantage. Okay. However, like you said, we work with a lot of companies and we have a lot of partners.
I want to continue with our guest. John Roese is with us. He's Global Chief Technology Officer at Dell Technologies, still with us from New Hampshire. Hey, John, we were talking, Tim and I, in the break, and just, curious about, as people go, right, Tim, to build out their data centers, you do wonder how busy it kind of gets for Dell.
Yeah, I'm wondering how big, John, the AI server opportunity is for Dell in 2025, and then how big it could be over the next few years. What are you folks talking about internally and externally?
Well, so I'm a CTO, so I'm not going to talk about any particular year.
But are you really busy, John?
I am extraordinarily busy. But let me paint a picture that's a little longer term. And that is, look, we are, as I mentioned, we're in now year 2 of the AI cycle, the modern AI cycle, and year 1 was all about surprise, get organized. Year 2 is about the first kind of enterprise deployments and kind of the prototypes. What that means is that the enterprise build out hasn't actually begun. Really? And if we look at the size of the AI market today and what's going on, it's a pretty interesting market. What's happening is we're building the foundational technologies. We're training the large language models, which is a very robust ecosystem right now. We are developing the tool chains. And as you can see from just the state of the industry, it's a pretty exciting and a pretty significant shift. That is in front of the enterprise cycle, where conservatively, most people, when you look over the long term, the AI cycle is about rebalancing a sizable portion of the work in the world into the machine layer. And so as that occurs, it represents, sometimes we use the phrase, we're in the training era now, we're about to enter the inference era for enterprise, which is AI gets put into production. And when it does, you can calculate, imagine a world where, a third of the work is now happening in a machine layer. It's being done by a machine, an AI system. What does that look like? How big is that? Well, you can't calculate it accurately, but it's a gigantic number, and it's as big as the internet build out. It's as big as the Industrial Revolution in many of the discussions that we have. The timing on it, it's an extended cycle. This will be a 20-year cycle. But we're about to enter that phase, and what it tells us is it's a significant amount of replumbing of enterprise. It's building out AI factories. It's rethinking your data strategy. It's rethinking your footprint in the multi-cloud. And all of that tends to, given our breadth and depth in our ecosystem, drag us into an awful lot of customer conversations and a pretty active world, even in advance of the significant build-outs occurring on the inference side.
So if we're only in year 2 when it comes to AI, where are corporates in their AI journey? How do they adopt their technology? We know Dell won a meaningful chunk of Tesla's AI rollout, for example, but where are corporates in their AI journey?
Yeah, the corporate, as I mentioned before, last year it was all about getting your feet on the ground, understanding the technology, learning what a large language model, learning what RAG was. And this year it's all about finding those first projects. The first projects are largely under development in most large enterprises, and some of them are emerging as chatbots and other services that we're starting to see. And there are definitely early examples of technology that have been deployed as new offerings. But the full pivot, where a company now declares that I am in the center of my business, building my product, selling my product, servicing my product, engaging with my customers based on primarily an AI architecture, that is still work to be done. And so I think, at this point, we're still right now in most large enterprises in the first proof of concepts, the first prototypes. But one of the things that's different about AI is it does not take 3 years to build one of those. You can go from idea based on the tool chains available to having something in production that you can start to really do. And we're doing that inside of Dell, make your developers more productive in a matter of months. And so the velocity of this cycle is something that we've never seen before, which means the gap between getting your feet on the ground and being in production and transforming your enterprise is not a 10-year cycle.
Hey, John, I keep hearing, you've said it, and I've had other guests, but when they talk about AI and inference, right? Am I saying it correctly? Yeah,
Inference, yeah.
Right. How is that different from AI training? And is that kind of a new concept, or is that just something more complicated when it comes to generative AI?
No, they're part of the same cycle. The idea behind AI is look, you're trying to have a machine do some kind of cognitive work, answer a service call, sell something, write code. In order to do that, the first step is that you must have that machine have some access to the knowledge necessary to do that, which is what training is about. The difference in large language models is that we've developed techniques that allow us to, instead of trying to, as human beings, decide how to code, we've learned that if you just expose these new techniques, these new technologies, large language models, to a gigantic set of coding, just examples of coding, they will classify them, organize them, create a neural network, and interestingly enough, they will then be able to replicate that intelligence, that behavior. And so the training phase is about taking gobs of data. In the current phase, it's the entire internet, and run it into these models that create systems that can understand or communicate human language, that can code. And all that is them deriving from a gigantic data set the knowledge that's contained within it to create a set of skills. That's training. Inference is totally different. Inference is once you have that model, now you want to do something with it. You have a thing that can code, great. Well, inference is when you tell it to code a program, to actually produce source code that does something.
Right.
And so they're just two halves of the same coin. One is the learning to create the capability. The other is the act of using the capability in production.
Hey, listen, something I got to ask you. It's a story that's on the Bloomberg, and this has to do with Nobel laureate. He's also an economics professor. We're talking about Paul Romer, and he was talking with our team here, and he said runaway confidence in artificial intelligence risks repeating the mistakes of the crypto hype bubble of only 2 years ago. He says right now there's way too much confidence about the future trajectory of AI. When people project this forward, I think they're at risk of making a very serious mistake. Do you think that there's too much confidence about AI? Do you think there's too much euphoria?
Yeah, two answers to that. In the general population, I think it's a very confusing space because we have basically the human race is maybe susceptible to science fiction, and we think that what we're producing is artificial general intelligence, and we're producing these sentient beings. These are not sentient beings. These are technologies that do stuff. Yeah, maybe sometime. We all believe there's a path to AGI. It's just not in the near term. That whole dialogue in the, let's call it the consumer general market, which is primarily where most of the big public AI players play, is a risk because people think these have personalities. They don't understand the technology. When you come to the enterprise world, it is far more conservative. There is no enterprise in the world that's trying to build the Terminator or a sentient being. What we are doing is we're applying the techniques that were pioneered in the public AI world and large language model space to very specific problems within a corporation that could benefit from it. Right. Writing code, finding your customers, engaging to solve problems. Those are the things that are mattering. So enterprise is kind of boring, to be perfectly honest, versus what is in the art of the possible in the public world. However, as you know, our industrial complex is quite large and the impact is much bigger.
Great stuff. Already looking forward to the next time we get to catch up. John, thank you so much. Be well. John Roese, he's Global Chief Technology Officer at Dell Technologies, joining us from New Hampshire. You are listening and watching Bloomberg Businessweek. Carol Massar, along with Tim Stenovec, and this is Bloomberg.
Some disturbing information that we found ahead of this next interview. A report by the global media company with a health and biotech focus, Marianne Liebert, found that, quote, in nearly 3/4 of the cases where a disease afflicts primarily one gender, the funding pattern favors males, in that either the disease affects more women and is underfunded with respect to burden, or the disease affects more men and it's overfunded. So double whammy when it comes to the gender health gap.
Yeah. Meantime, in a recent report from McKinsey, it found that reducing the time women spend in poor health by 25% could be worth $1 trillion, in large part because health disparities disproportionately hit women during their working years. So let's get to it. There are huge disparities between men and women's health that definitely, Tim, need to be addressed.
Back with us to talk about that gender health gap is Elisabeth Staudinger, managing board member at the $65 billion medical tech company Siemens Healthineers, publicly traded one, I should note. She joins us from Germany. Elisabeth, good to have you back with us. Thanks for staying up a little bit later once again to join us from Germany. Talk a little bit about what you're doing over at Siemens Healthineers to address this gender health gap.
As you already mentioned in the opening, there is significant disparities. And if you, just to make this tangible, if you think of the typical Hollywood heart attack, where somebody kind of reaches to his breast, has this burning sensation in the arm, and everybody will start rushing and saying, oh my God, something really serious is going on. Let's rush that patient to the ED and take care of him. Unfortunately, when you're a woman, most likely the symptoms you will be feeling are different. And that matters because the likelihood as a woman to be misdiagnosed when you're having a heart attack is 50% higher than it is for men. And the likelihood that you will actually not make it when you're admitted to the hospital is actually twice as high as it is for a man. And that gives you a sense of the huge gap that we have and the huge disparities we have when it comes to looking at women's health and men's health and the big biases which are deeply ingrained into how we do things here.
Do men and women medical professionals, are they biased equally? In other words, do women doctors, women nurses also misdiagnose or underdiagnose women?
That's actually a very interesting question. And if you think of what people learn when they get their training, be it in nursing or in medical school, the typical default, everything starts from in research, but also in the training in med school is the man. And the women sometimes is considered that's the abnormal version of the human being. And that leads to a situation that both men and women may have that bias. At the same time, there is some data which shows that on average, women are more sensitive to some of these differences than men are, just maybe because they've also experienced it themselves.
It's funny, even kind of preparing for this segment, working with our producer, Elisabeth Staudinger, like, even research that's been done is the baseline is off of what's going on with men. And it's just interesting, like trying to find data that everything is kind of off of that base, if you will. It was a little discouraging, to say the least.
Right, there is a lot of bias which is somehow built into the system. In R&D funding, you mentioned that in your opening statement, but also in clinical studies for many, many, many years, women were completely underrepresented in the clinical studies, which then leads to medication being approved based on male samples only.
I'm wondering, Elisabeth, about the role of technology here. And we've had you on to talk about this in the past, but I'm wondering about bias when it comes to AI or when it comes to diagnoses, because if we talk about bias, it's something that's within every person and it's within doctors as well. Can we remove some of that bias if we use technology instead to make these medical decisions?
And that's actually a very interesting topic, because if you think of bias in people and bias in physicians, there is a lot of bias in the data which is used to train AI.
I was afraid you were going to say this.
But the good news is there is a lot of ways of dealing with that. I mean, we in Siemens Healthineers, we have more than 20 years of working on deep learning AI-based algorithms and dealing with patient data. We've built a huge database of more than 2 billion data points. And we can make sure, as we're training our algorithms, that we have a well-balanced and diverse sample that goes into creating the algorithms and the prediction of the results that are based on the software.
What faith
do
you
have? There is ways of kind of adjusting for that, but you have to make a very conscious effort.
That's what I was going to say. What faith do you have in that happening? Because I feel like, you know this, you know where I'm going to go. These are not new issues, concerns, problems in terms of, certainly when it comes, I feel like, with women and men and health and data. So what hopes do you have that effort will be made to make sure that women are incorporated into the data points?
I think there is a very strong link to how do we kind of ensure and also demand that the data that goes into the training of the AI does have the right balance and the right mix. So regulatory authorities can help here, but also companies, of course, can make sure. And we, for instance, we put a lot of effort and energy into making sure that we use high quality data, which is vetted, where we are confident and certain that the input we provide to the software and to the algorithms really reflects both the disease we want to see, as well as reflects a good sample across not only gender, but also other dimensions which matter.
So where do you go for the data to find unbiased data?
Well, ultimately,
or do you just correct for it?
You essentially correct for it.
Okay.
So when you pull together the sample you want to use, you make sure, okay, how many women do I have? How many men? What kind of, also do I have enough representation of Asians, of Indian, of African, of Caucasian patients, in order to make sure that we do not kind of over-index on any of those dimensions.
Yeah, fascinating. If we don't get this right, I mean, what's at stake? It sounds like a lot, and in terms of health of women overall, and I wonder how much in terms of gaps between developed world and developing world, you know, where that really maybe has an impact, or maybe it's everywhere.
I would say it is really everywhere.
Yeah.
You know, women are not simply small men, regardless of where you go on this planet. And I think it's also a reality that we cannot improve global health if we ignore half the world's population. And there is not only a risk, we've been speaking now a lot about the risk, but there's also real opportunity. Because if we manage to remove some of these barriers and can improve the health of women in the world globally, it will help everyone rise. Yeah, you mentioned the 1 trillion of GDP by 2040 that we could be tapping into if we did a better job at removing the barriers and the disparities in health.
Elisabeth, thank you for joining us. An important conversation. We always love it when you take the time to join us. And again, thanks for staying up late over there in Germany. Elisabeth Staudinger is managing board member over at Siemens Healthineers. It's a publicly traded med tech company, $65 billion market cap.